Hi all, and welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. The Stewardship Network's been doing these monthly webcasts for each and every second Wednesday of the month during the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. So if you are new to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast, welcome. And I see many familiar returning faces, so glad to have you all back with us. We've been gathering virtually like this for back when we didn't Zoom all day long. So we love the chance to bring our community together each month during the second Wednesday during the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. Today we'll be talking about the Lake Erie Island's history. As I said, I'm Lisa Brush with the Stewardship Network, and I'm really pleased to be here with Mike Gora, who is an author and historian who lives on one of the Great Lakes Islands in Lake Erie, and we'll be learning a little bit more about those islands. So Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
For those of you who are new to the Stewardship Network, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to protect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. We are capacity builders who want to lift up the work that you all do and link you together to learn from each other. We provide tools and resources so that you can stay outside doing the work to care for land and water in your communities. We formed in 1998 as a project. We formed a 501c3 in 2004, 6 years later. We are a national and international award-winning model for the networked way that we revolutionize the way that people care for land and water in their communities. We have thousands and thousands of partners. You all online are a great representation of those. We have our member communities, which are locally geographically based in various states around the world, around the country for now. We have inquiries from around the world. And our partnerships and collaborators are all volunteer NGOs to international NGOs, private consulting contractors and consultants, academics and researchers and educators, private property owners and volunteers, NGOs, you name it, municipalities, state, federal, tribal governmental units. So we really love the chance to bring the really incredible diversity of people and organizations who care for land and water together. It's a real privilege for us. As I said, we have our local member communities, and those are geographically based collaborative conservation communities made up of all of the organizations and individuals that care for land and water in their community, and they do awesome, amazing things. They do essentially on-the-ground conservation action, so maybe a combined roving field crew or prescribed fire crew or native seed collecting, so on-the-ground conservation action, and then they do learning and engagement events, so workshops and networking events, whether that's once a month, sit down at a bagel shop to talk about various topics related to caring for land and water, or online and in-person workshops. So if you're interested in learning more about those, go visit our website at stewardshipnetwork.org, follow us on Facebook, and we once a year bring everybody together at our annual conference. And back in April, when we had our call for abstracts out, I was like, I don't know that we're going to be able to do this in person. Even if something miraculous happens, I don't know if people are going to be able to afford it and want to travel and be in a room with 400 people. So we are going online with our conference. You can go to conference.stewardshipnetwork.org, or you'll be able to navigate there from our main website. The interactive agenda is live, so you can see the abstracts and the sessions. We're pricing registration at just $99. You know, we figure I'm seeing some conferences that are still like $350, and I'm like, these are unprecedented times. So just $99. It's going to run for a half a day, starting at noon Eastern time zone. And then we'll also have all of the same elements that we normally have. Our fabulous bookstore that people rave about will now be going online. We'll do our water ceremony online. We'll do networking sessions online. We'll have some virtual field trips. We'll do our story slam again. So again, I think it's going to be a really grand time of bringing people together. And we look forward to seeing you there. Hope that you learn more about it. Let us know if you have any questions. I want to also thank you all online who are donors and financial contributors to the Stewardship Network. We have donors from $5 to $250,000. And we really appreciate your support. And currently, your dollars will be matched 1 for 1. So your dollars will go twice as far. You can go to stewardshipnetwork.org and donate online, mail us a check, and find out all kinds of instructions there. So again, really thank you so much. Your support really enables us to broadcast these free online interactive monthly webcasts. We're nearing our 200th one of them. So thank you all. I want to also thank Mike. Mike Gora, thank you so much for joining us, author and historian. And Mike, I want to let you take it away. Take it away from me and let's see if we can transition over there.
Okay, you should now all see my screen. Let me know if that's working.
That's working.
Great. Well, let me thank you for the introduction. Normally, I just give presentations on the history of Middle Bass Island, but this has been a great opportunity to finally put together a number of things I've gathered on the history of the Lake Erie Islands. I wrote an article about that for Inland Seas magazine last summer. I'll be talking about that, but I have a lot of ground to cover. And before I start, let me just say that I have really enjoyed working with Lisa for a couple of years now on our projects in the Great Lakes Islands Alliance. I think this is the first presentation we're actually doing under the banner of the Great Lakes Islands Alliance, and I hope we get some of the other islands to do some.
Exactly. Thanks, Mike.
4 of the 15 member islands are in Lake Erie. 3 of them are in Ohio, Kelly's, Middle Bass, and South Bass, and 1 is in Pealey. Pealey is by far the largest island in Lake Erie. The history of Lake Erie is a little odd because Lake Erie was actually the last of the Great Lakes to be discovered. If you look at this very early map of the approaches to the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River went as far as Lake Ontario, and the Ottawa River went over to Georgian Bay and Lake Huron, but there was no direct and easy access to Lake Erie. So Lake Erie ended up being the last lake discovered. Basically in the Great Lakes, 1535, Jacques Cartier reaches Montreal. 1603, Champlain reaches Montreal. He asks the Indians whether either river is a route to the Western Sea and hears about Niagara Falls and the lake beyond that. Various people heard about Lake Erie long before they ever got there. So it's very hard to say accurately when Lake Erie was actually visited and discovered. Let's go down to 1611, where Nicholas Mignot travels up the Ottawa River, lies about reaching and crossing Lake Huron, but returns in 1612 to tell the false story and does help Champlain with his tales. Lakes Huron and Ontario were both discovered in 1615. In July 1615, the Christian invasion starts. And we'll find a lot of stories from the 17th and the 18th century of Christians from various groups working with different Indian groups in different ways. 1 or 2 of those will play a big role in the Lake Erie Islands. September 615, Etienne Brule reaches Lake Ontario. Lake Michigan was discovered in 1634. And in 1641, 2 Jesuits start a mission at Sault Ste. Marie. We're going to be hearing more about that mission in a little while because it has an interesting link to Lake Erie. When we first started hearing about Lake Erie, we heard about the Erie Indians, the Cat Nation, which were first noted in 1624 when the Hurons at Lake Erie told Father Sagard about Erie Ronan, people living south of the lake. The term is translated as cat people, but it really means long-tailed, possibly referring to pumas or panthers, less likely raccoons, or even less likely the shape of Lake Erie. Another mention was made in the French-Jesuit relation from 1647 and 1648, describing the lake above Niagara Falls. This lake, called Erie, was formerly inhabited on its southern shores by certain tribes who we call the Nation of the Cat. And one of the reasons that Lake Erie was not explored early was because the Indians living on the south shore were known to be very ferocious and not friendly. We'll talk more about that. This 1643 map of New France is the very first one to hint at Lake Erie, and we're going to take a closer look in the next slide at an enlargement of the relevant piece. In the middle here, we see Lake Huron. Down in the lower right, we see Lake Ontario. Down here in the middle, you see what looks like two little lakes with islands in them. The north shore, if you traveled across the north shore of Lake Erie, when you crossed Long Point, it would actually look as if there were two different lakes there. And that's the reason for the first map showing Lake Erie in two parts. And you can speculate about whether that's supposed to be an island in Lake Erie there in the western part, and why there seems to be a big island in the eastern part. I'm not really sure. But that's the first map that actually labels Lake Erie, Lake Loch Erie down, let's see, I think you can see my mouse down here. The 1650 map is the first one that shows Lake Erie as Loch de Shot and shows its approximate correct shape down here. Lake Huron up here and Lake Superior, and I guess some representation of Lake Michigan here. Now, the first documented Lake Erie trip is actually an interesting one from 1669, in which first Louis Joliet and Pierre enter Lake Erie traveling south from Lake Huron and then travel overland along the north shore. And they meet a group of 23 people traveling in 7 canoes near Hamilton, Ontario. And it's that group of Indians, together with 2 Sulpician priests, Fathers Dollier and Galinée, who decide to cross Lake Erie with their Indian friends in canoes and head to the upper lakes. So in 1669, they started the first crossing of Lake Erie in canoes. They spent the winter on the north shore, somewhere west of Long Point. I don't remember exactly where. There's actually, I know, some markers in Canada where some kind of a historic site where they spent the winter there. And basically, they went all the way up to Sault Ste. Marie, returned in 1670, drew a map, and that 1670 map was the first showing islands in the western part of Lake Erie. Now, maps being what they are, all the maps of Lake Erie Islands were basically inaccurate until 1820, when the Treaty of Ghent survey of the US-Canada border created the first accurate maps of the Great Lakes, excluding Lake Michigan, because that wasn't part of the border survey. That's true of many parts of the country everywhere. It wasn't until there was the first official Army survey or something like that that you ever got accurate maps. But if you look at that date, 1670, we are currently, this year, we have the 350th anniversary of the first map showing the islands in western Lake Erie, and the first, the 350th anniversary of the first crossing of Lake Erie by white people in boats. Here's another 1656 map. Here's Lake Ontario, and down near the bottom, you see a fairly good map of Lake Erie as far as the shape goes. I think we covered that. This is actually the map drawn by Dollier and Galinée in 1670. And you notice down at the bottom of this, Lake Erie, you see a few dots here. Those dots are actually the first appearance of the Lake Erie Islands on a map. You see the big peninsula here, which is probably supposed to be Long Point. The unusual thing about this map is that it disappeared in the Sulpician archives in France until 1849, when somebody discovered it. Here's another tracing of that map showing it in a slightly different form. Again, down at the bottom here, you see the islands in Lake Erie. The path here is the route that the canoes traveled along the north shore. And I remember reading in one of the descriptions of that the birch bark canoes that those Indians made were about the only canoes that were strong enough and light enough to carry 4 people and supplies and also be lifted by just 1 person. So quite a feat back then. A few footnotes to that 1670 map. Here we wintered in the most beautiful place I have seen in Canada, with the abundance of fruit trees, hackberries, grapes, etc. The text makes the comment accompanied by 7 other Frenchmen, the first of all European people to have wintered on this lake, but those Frenchmen were not part of the canoe excursion. I'm going through this a little bit quickly because I think I have a little bit too much ground to cover. Here's one very nice one very nice picture of Delier and Galladay arriving in Sault Ste. Marie in May 1670, and they were extremely disappointed because there were already the 2 Jesuits that I mentioned earlier that had started a mission there. The Jesuits told them they don't need any more missionaries. That's basically why Delier and Galladay turned around and came back across Lake Erie. Usually when you hear about the first crossing of Lake Erie, you hear about the voyage of the Griffin in 1679. But the Griffin was the first sailing ship. And it was 10 years earlier that it was actually crossed by white men in canoes. There's been a lot written about that voyage of the Griffin. She sank in Lake Huron. There are some people who think she's been found. I don't know the current status of how certain that finding is. There's a little description of that. There was a man named La Salle in the 17th century who was possessed by the vision of sailing westward to the sunrise through the new continent of America, to China, and to the wealth and wonder of the Far East. After he completed Fort Frontenac at Kingston on Lake Ontario in 1673 and built ships there, he had a shipload of material brought out from France and carried up the steep heights of Niagara on men's backs. With that, he built another ship above the falls to sail him towards China on the higher levels as far as she could go. This was the famous bark Griffin. The last sentence, like a summer comet, the bark Griffin shone in the star-sown firmament of the Great Lakes of America for 40 nights, then vanished into the limbo of unsolved mysteries, and that was in a storm on Lake Huron. Now, since we're going to talk primarily about islands in Lake Erie, we get into the very complicated problem of how many islands are there in Lake Erie? And I start here by saying there are at least 37 real islands, but an exact count depends on what you decide to include or exclude. There are also 2 very different counts of 1,752 or 2,176, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The 4 types of islands that cause a counting problem are islands that existed in the 19th century, but now are either connected to the mainland or submerged. Islands not quite in Lake Erie, like Johnson's Island and Sandusky Bay, or Boys Bank Blank Island at the mouth of the Detroit River. We do not really consider those to be in Lake Erie. There are a couple of artificial islands for lighthouses, and a large number of tiny unnamed islands. So I say the exact count of islands is at the reader's discretion, but here are the islands to consider. Groups 1 and 3 below contain the 37 real islands in Lake Erie. I think that slide is not in the right position. Maybe I'll come back to it. But here are the 15 core Ohio islands in Lake Erie. You count the number of inhabited ones. I think we get 10 of those are inhabited. Most of them are not inhabited year-round. Ballast Island, just to give one example, is a small island with 9 homes and no ferry service. 6 of the homes are owned by one extended family, and the family sort of has a private ferry that leaves the marina on Catawba Island 6 o'clock on Friday evening every week and pulls into the island about 6:30. That's what they do all summer. we'll be talking about most of these in more detail. I will be looking at pictures of all of them, I think. And we get 4 other Ohio Island candidates. Cedar Point is sometimes mentioned as a former island, but we're not sure about that. Gull Island is interesting. It's listed on 19th century maps as a separate island between Middle Island and Kelly's. It's now just an underwater shoal. And one of my interesting island history experiences had to do with Gull Island. I started the Middle Bass Island website back in 1999 and learned quickly that people look mostly at all the nice new pictures of sunrises and marinas and things like that we post. But the people who get in touch with me are the people who find something of historical interest there. And there was a woman in New Orleans who wrote to me and said, I can't find Gull Island on the maps of Lake Erie. Can you tell me where it was? My grandfather was the first lighthouse keeper there. So I write back to her and tell her, well, I know there was never a lighthouse on Gull Island, and it's now just an underwater shoal. And she says, but I have pictures of it. Well, to make a long story short, we figured out that in the 19th century, there were 2 Gull Islands in Lake Erie. And one is the island that's now called Mohawk Island in Canada. And the pictures she sent me are now on some of the lighthouse sites as the best pictures ever of the old lighthouse on Mohawk Island.
Oh, that's so fun, Mike, right?
Yeah.
That's great. Hey, and Mike, Dick asks whether or not there's an opportunity to recognize the islands on the west shore of Lake Erie in Plum Creek Bay, Counselor's Island, Follies Island, and Man's Island.
I'm sorry, which bay?
Plum Creek Bay. All near Monroe, Michigan.
I am not familiar with those. Are there any named islands there?
Sounds like Counselor's, Follies, and Man's Island.
I guess I'm going to have to do some more research.
Exactly. Okay, and I can put you in touch with Dick too.
There's no end to this list.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Johnson's Island has a lot of Civil War history, but it's in Sandusky Bay, close to Lake Erie, so we're not going to talk much about that. But there was a Civil War prison there, and there were some steamers hijacked in an attempt to free the prisoners, and that failed. And that's all I'll say about that. Cofferloo Island was an artificial island named after the builder's wife, Catherine, and his sons, Frank and Louis. It is now really filled in to be part of the extension of Cedar Point. Some other core islands, Turtle Island, which is half in Ohio, half in Michigan. West Sister Island, which used to have a nice working lighthouse. Guard Island near Toledo. A couple of others that I don't really know much about. And then the rest of this list, the 22. Hidden chickens are, well, East Sister is interesting because there actually is a picture showing agriculture in the 19th century. There's nothing on it now. Hidden chickens, one has a big private club that's been there since the 19th century, and it's probably the oldest island club that looks almost exactly the way it did when it was built in the 1890s. The Long Point area is sort of confusing because there are many islands there. There are many small islands off Long Point. Only 3 have distinct names on most maps: Ryerson, Second, and Snow. And Ryerson's, trying to remember the Canadian history. I think Ryerson was the first lieutenant governor of Canada, or was university named after him or something like that. But anyways, the Ryerson that went to Canada was known to be a loyalist soldier from a regiment in Connecticut that was part of a group that tried to kill George Washington at some point during the Revolution. And then he escaped to Canada and his descendants became quite famous there. Middle Island is interesting. It's 7 miles due east of where we have our house on Middle Bass Island. It's the southernmost point in Canada. used to be a lighthouse there. We'll be looking at some pictures and some more information about that. I'm going to skip some of these, but I'll mention briefly there are some interesting historical references to an island of the Long Point area called Millionaires Island, which was supposedly a very exclusive private hunting preserve. It's where the DuPonts used to go duck hunting 100 years ago, and it's still a very exclusive club southwest of Ryerson's Island. North Harbor in Ontario has one house on it. That one is interesting because the fellow from Port Clinton, Ohio, who built the house there in the 1950s, brought all the material over from the US without ever going through Canadian customs, and eventually Canadian customs found out about it. Then of course there's Pealey. We'll be looking more closely at Pealey, and the rest of these I don't know much about, but you may want to look them up. And then there are the even more exotic island candidates. Bird Island, shown on a few 19th century maps. This was in Lake Erie near the mouth of the Niagara River. It's not on current maps. Point Blank we'll skip because it's really in the Detroit River. The Detroit River Lighthouse is an artificial island in Lake Erie. There are historical references to a little sister island, but it's not clear if that refers to West Sister Island, Little Sister Island, and the Maumee River, but doesn't seem to be in Lake Erie. And then there's the Southeast Shoal Lighthouse off Point Pealey. We'll be looking at some pictures of that. The list of 37 islands can be found on the Middle Bass Island website. The report listing all 2,176 is at greatlakesislands.info. Let's see, what part of that description do we want to read? That 2176 is about 25% too high, but as counted includes 130 Western Lake Erie islands and various others. It also includes most of the river basins within 5 or 10 miles of the Lake Erie shore. So it includes many small islands and swamps that are not really part of the lake. I haven't really tried to figure out exactly what's in that list, but it's, as far as which list you actually decide to use, that's up to you. It says the final count of islands in Lake Erie is 1,752 and includes 42 large islands. I have not yet taken the time to reconcile that list of 42 large islands with my list of 37 to see what the differences are. Maybe one of you will find some time for that. This is a nice picture of the 1679 boat that went up Lake Erie. The sailing ship, the Griffin, with Father Hennepin. Some of you may have seen a reference to Father Hennepin saying a mass on Middle Bass Island. That is a myth that does not appear in any of the diaries that are part of that trip. They sailed north of the islands and did not stop at them. Now, the 18th century gets interesting because that's where we start finding a lot of diaries and other books that mention travels on Lake Erie's, a number of which also include Indians. David Zeisberger was a Moravian missionary who was traveling with a group of Indians from somewhere in the upper lakes to eastern Ohio. And he, his traveling companion, John Heckewelder, and about 40 Indians got basically stuck on the Lake Erie Islands for the best part of a month because they never got the right winds to go east, and wrote quite a bit about that. We'll be talking more about that. And then there are books like The Indian Captivity of O.M. Spencer. A young boy was kidnapped by the Indians somewhere in southern Ohio. And he was released 10 years later and has a little bit of a narrative about his visit to Burgundy Bay in 1793. Here's part of that book. He lived with the Indians from 1783 to 93 after being kidnapped. Left them on February 28th, 1793, and spent a night on South Bass Island. He also visited Middle Bass Island and documented large snakes there. Catawba Island is now permanently attached to the mainland, but it has a famous rock known as Nabagon, the eternal watcher of both weak and strong. According to legend, Nabagon was a valiant Ottawa Indian whose facial profile magically appeared on a rugged cliff. And you can see that picture on the right. There's also a nice poem about it. In the 18th century, the Lake Erie Islands were best known as Rattlesnake Islands. Here's a 1744 German map in which the islands, are called the Klapperschlangeninsel, basically Rattlesnake Islands. 1755, the French called the islands the Rattlesnake Islands. How many of those were the rattlesnakes and how many of them were just the water snakes, we don't know for sure, but there definitely were a lot of rattlesnakes, and they were eventually killed when 19th century settlers brought in pigs to take care of the snakes. 1765, we have a nice map of the islands marked. This is where the Indians crossed the lake here in canoes from isle to isle. You can read the text there. The Indians crossed the lake here in canoes from isle to isle. The Indians never had permanent settlements on the islands, but they obviously came there quite a bit to fish. They had some fishing camps that we'll talk about a little bit later. Probably had some significant summer settlements on Kelly's Island, but not on the others. Lots of snake stories if you take your time to look for them. 1721, we perceived the land on the south shore and two little islands which lie very near it. They're called the Rattlesnake Islands. We're told they are so infested with these reptiles that the air is infected with them. 1768, there are several islands near the west end so infested with rattlesnakes that it's very dangerous to land. It's impossible that any place can produce a greater number of all kinds of these reptiles than this does, particularly of the water snake. The lake is covered near the banks of the islands with a large pond lily, and on each of these lay, when I passed over it, reefs of water snakes basking in the sun, which amounted to myriads. And even on Middle Bass Island, I occasionally see piles of probably 20 or 30 water snakes intertwined with each other on a single big rock. And actually at our deck, which is on the water, in front of the deck, there's a bush growing in the riprap, and there are usually snakes lying on the top of the bush sunning themselves. Just more snake stories, 1755. These islands lie in a line across the lake, or they're just in sight of each other. Some of the Wyandottes or Ottawas frequently make their winter hunt on these islands. Excepting wild fowl and fish, there's scarcely any game here but raccoons, which are amazing plenty and exceedingly large and fat. 1791, Lake Erie is famous also for its serpents in the western part of this lake, from Viper Islands to the shores of the continent. Over a space of more than 20 miles are spread large water lilies. In summer, the leaves of these plants are covered with serpents entwined in one another. And last but not least, 1793, O.M. Spencer, on his way back home after 10 years of captivity with Indians, we spent a part of Saturday afternoon in an excursion through Middle Bass Island, in which we killed several large rattlesnakes. I narrowly escaped being bitten by one at least 3 feet long, over which I stepped as he crossed the path. The captain, who had gone to a small pond a few hundred yards ahead of us to shoot ducks, returned in a short time running and out of breath, declaring that a monster, a snake more than a rod in length, the moment he fired at some ducks, issued from the long grass. There are many other snake stories like that. I'm going to skip this one. Except in the middle of the second paragraph on the bottom, the number of hogs roaming through the woods of Ohio have done one good, and that is they have nearly eradicated the whole breed of rattlesnakes. If one is anywhere near, the hog is sure to kill and eat him, and his bite, as I am told, has no more effect upon the animal than a common scratch. Now we get into, excuse me, some more recent but 19th century maps. We occasionally hear of North Bass Island as St. George's Island and Middle Bass Island as Lafleur Island. St. George's Island was a name given to North Bass Island when Governor John Graves Simcoe of Canada, or was it Lieutenant Governor? I don't remember, was stopping at Burgundy Bay, and his wife decided that since it was St. George's Day, we have to name one of the islands after St. George. The official postal name of North Bass Island is still Isle St. George. But back in the 19th century, those names, St. George's Island and Lafleur Island, appeared mostly just on the British and French maps and not on the American maps, which used the North Bass, Middle Bass, and South Bass names. Notice on this map, Kelly's Island was still called Cunningham Island. Middle Island is just south of Pealey Island. The rest of the islands are fairly accurate. This may be a difficult sketch to look at, but this was actually the first fairly accurate map of the islands, produced in 1819, I think, by the International Boundary Survey, following the Treaty of Ghent. You can basically, here you can see Middle Bass Island. Down here you can see South Bass Island, and the lines are the sighting lines that we used for the survey. This was really the very first accurate map of the Lake Erie Islands. Now, there were lots of disputes about the various islands and the border itself, and the last disputes weren't really settled until about 1840. But there were really no disputes about the Lake Erie portion of this. There were lots of issues. For instance, if there's an island in the Detroit River, does that island go to Canada or does it go to the US? Lots of issues like that. But I don't think that the Lake Erie maps ever changed. There were some disputes at some point about an Isle St. George, but it turned out that was not the Isle St. George in Lake Erie. It was an Isle St. George in one of the upper lakes. I don't remember which one. Little footnote to this is that it was at about the time of the survey, at the bottom of the page here, the first steamer appeared on Lake Erie, the Walk in the Water, which arrived in August 1818. And there are 3 different stories from 1818 of people who came on that ship and visited the caves at Burgundy Bay. This is one of my favorite maps. This is an 1886 map of the Lake Erie Islands from one of the first pictorial tourist booklets. This is actually the inside back cover of that booklet. The islands are a little bit on the creative side as far as size and location, but it's a pretty good, attractive representation, and a lot of people like this map. Again, you see the big islands. Pealey Island in Canada is by far the biggest. Kelly's Island is the largest on the US side. Burgundy Bay is a little bit smaller than Kelly's at about 1,500 acres, and North Bass and Middle Bass are about 750 acres each. Here's a nice aerial picture of those islands. South Bass Island, you can see the airport. Middle Bass Island, you can see the marina here. Middle Bass Island is somewhat shaped like a duck. We call this the head of the duck. It's called East Point. Of course, South Bass Island also has an area here called East Point. Ballast Island was the little private island I mentioned that has just 9 homes, 6 of which are owned by one extended family. Rattlesnake Island is a location of a very exclusive and expensive private club. Now, I haven't really talked too much about the Indian history of the islands, but it's sort of hard to get into. The Indians were moving around a lot in the early 19th century. Indians from further east were being pushed into Ohio, and here's a list of the Ohio Indian Reserves in 1807 to 1818. And there's even a book called The Other Trail of Tears that explains a lot about the awful manner in which most of these Indians were then pushed further west into various locations. I bring this up because there are 2 very good presentations about Ohio Indians in general that are on the website of the Catawba Island Historical Society. And if you go to Catawba Island Historical Society.com/events, you'll find 2 very interesting presentations about Indian life. Oops, I'm sorry, my fingers were on the wrong keys. Okay, what have we actually found on the various islands? On Middle Bass Island, we know the Indians had summer fishing camps on Middle Bass, but no permanent settlements. This is a picture of Indian arrowheads found on Middle Bass at the site of a fishing camp on the east shore near where the eastern end of the runway is now. Here's another article about finding some artifacts on the south shore of Middle Bass, 69 to 73. Kelly's Island has a much better and more interesting Indian background. If you look at the map here, you will see, I'm sorry, need to watch where my hands are. There are a couple of Indian mounds here and here. There are Indian earthworks. There's an inscription rock down here, and there's another inscription rock on the north shore. This is an old diagram of the North Shore inscription rock with some Quinnipog on it. That's, I think, the term they used for the types of pictographs used on those. That inscription rock has disappeared. I'm not quite sure why. But there is a much bigger inscription rock that's on the south shore, and it's a major tourist attraction. And there are some nice diagrams of the Quinnipog drawings that are on there. There are also some interesting interpretations of what those drawings might have meant. Lots of Indian artifacts found on Kelly's Island. And in 1974, something unusual, a slate elbow pipe, article about it in the Ohio Archaeologist. 1786, David Zeisberger, a Moravian missionary, took a group of Indians from the Detroit area to a settlement. And you notice he was on the islands, South Bass and Middle Bass, from April 29th, 1786 to Tuesday, May 30th, 1786. Still unable to sail east, they then land on Catawba Island on May 30th. That's interesting because as soon as they land on Catawba Island, they met 10 Ottawas out hunting who came to us. They were much amazed to meet such a number of people in a place far and wide where there was no way or road. And basically, the Ottawas helped them get to Sandusky. After crossing Catawba Island, they had to cross another little lagoon to get to Marblehead. And from Marblehead, they had to cross Sandusky Bay to get to Sandusky. And they did all of that with the help of local Indians. A lot of very interesting information in Zeisberger's diary about all that. Zeisberger is very controversial because if you read his diary carefully, you'll see that he suggests, or we interpret, that the original Put-in Bay, which he calls Pudding Bay, was the harbor that existed when Sugar Island was still connected to Middle Bass Island. And we know at that time that back in 1786, Gibraltar was called St. George's Island. That name had not been applied to North Bass Island yet. And the official name of Put-in Bay was Hope's Cove, which that name came from the ship HMS Cove that had been stuck there for a winter. David Zeisberger's story is about moving around the islands, the relative sizes of the islands, the fact that Pudding Bay was a good deep water harbor, which Hope's Cove, today's Put-in Bay, is not, are all suggestions that the original Put-in Bay was really on Middle Bass Island. Of course, that's controversial. The people at Put-in Bay do not like that interpretation, and you can choose whichever one you want. It's worth noting that at about the same time, Green Island was called Strontian Island, and there was a lot of strontium mined there in the early 19th century. Before we get to the next slide, let me point out that this little connecting piece between today's Sugar Island and Middle Bass Island, well, whoops. Sorry, my fingers are on the wrong place. Okay, this little connecting strip was probably eroded by horse carts because the best deep water dock for this area is actually today's Sugar Island dock. And when the early logging started on Middle Bass Island, it was probably the horse carts going to the ships that eroded this part of the reef. But that reef, here's a picture I took in 2003 during a seiche, that Sugar Island in the distance, Middle Bass Island in the foreground. And you can see that road that you could actually still walk across or drive across, which was probably worn down by the horse carts. And for what it's worth, during normal high water, that's a place where a lot of boats have accidents because they don't look at their charts and they hit that reef.
So Mike, Emily asks about the seiches and whether they, so that they can both cause land masses to merge together as well as to kind of weather apart.
Well, they don't cause land masses to move, but in this case, we regularly have seiches where the water can go up or down 6 feet overnight based on the way the wind is blowing the water. If it goes down 6 feet overnight in the west, it'll go up 6 feet in Buffalo, and then it comes back pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But this is just a great example of where you can see something that was really there earlier that's normally not visible. This is an interesting little map of the main islands in the archipelago and a tour that the Port Clinton High School group has actually planned for next fall, starting in Port Clinton, going to West Sister Island, going to the Battle of Lake Erie site, going from there to North Bass Island, up to Hen and Chickens, up to, I don't know why, I'm not sure what keeps moving the mouse in unintended ways.
Exactly, touchy.
Yep.
Sensitive mice.
Yep. But let's go on to take a closer look at the islands as we see them today. Catawba Island is basically, it was an independent island until 1897 when they filled in a little piece in the southwest tip and connected it to the mainland. It's now up at the north tip of it is where the main ferry dock is to the US Lake Erie Islands. If you look at the picture, you can see lots of huge marinas. It's where just about all the mainlanders store their boats that they use for fishing and to come and visit the islands. Switched from grape growing to peach growing around the 1890s. A couple of different views of it. This road here is the main road that most people take when they go out to Catawba Island. The picture on the bottom is a picture of one of the marinas on the west side of Catawba Island. West Sister Island has a pretty old lighthouse. It's now National Wildlife Refuge. If you go by boat from Detroit to the islands on the most direct route, you'll probably go fairly close to West Sister Island. Isle St. George was a major winery and wine growing island for many, many years. About 15 years ago, the state of Ohio purchased about 3/4 of the island to preserve it from development. It operates as North Bass Island State Park, which is basically a primitive state park. Although now they actually have one lodge that you can rent. As of January 2007, there were about 24 permanent residents. What do you say? There are probably only 6 to 8 people that really spend most of the winter there. And even most of those take some long Florida vacations in the winter. But one of the two, North Bass has never had any regular ferry service. You can only get there by private boat or private plane. But one of the people who lives there in the winter says, if I couldn't live here in the winter, I wouldn't want to live here at all.
Great.
Whatever.
True Islander.
Yep. Hen Island and the chickens. There's the old Quinnipog Club at Hen Island. You will be run off that island if you try to land there, but it's, according to the club's website, the US Presidents Grover Cleveland and William McKinley have visited there to go fishing. East Sister Island. It's part of the Pealey archipelago. It was declared a sovereign state on April 2, 2020 in response to Canada's inaction to the COVID-19 epidemic, but has not been recognized by anyone. We do have pictures of some agriculture, people growing crops there in the in the early 20th century, I think. Middle Sister Island, don't know much about it. I've occasionally seen it up for sale. Pretty desolate place. Last time it was for sale was 2018 for $685,000. I have not followed up on that. North Harbor Island is the one I mentioned that's just north of East Sister Island that basically has one private house that was built by one of the McCanns in Port Clinton in the 1950s, old material brought from the US, and eventually got into some trouble with Canadian customs. Pealey Island, largest island in Lake Erie. It's the southernmost populated point in Canada. It has a slightly milder climate than inland areas. Its climate is one of the mildest in Canada. The island has long been known for vineyards and winemaking. Very agricultural, very, very pretty place. Originally leased from Indian tribes by Thomas McKee in 1788. Winemaking began in the 1860s. Pealey wine and winery are very popular, and even in Ohio, we like to buy a lot of the Pealey wines. A lot of marshes were drained for raising vegetables and tobacco. It's a major eco-tourist destination. It's on 2 major migratory bird routes, the Atlantic Flyway and the Mississippi Flyway. And as far as bird routes, it's also part of the monarch migration routes from Point Pealey to Pealey Island to the Bass Islands and off to wherever they go in Mexico. It's part of the township of Pealey, separated township, separate from Essex County. Township consists of 9 islands. The annual Pealey Island pheasant hunt, which started in the 1920s, used to draw up to 2,200 hunters. The hunters spend more money than the typical summer tourists because a lot of the summer tourists are just day trippers or one-nighters. The Pealey Island Lighthouse is fascinating because it was built in 1833. It's the second oldest Canadian lighthouse in Lake Erie. And one of the least known stories about it is it's where Lieutenant Robert E. Lee, the later General Robert E. Lee of Civil War fame, wrote of killing the lighthouse keeper in 1835. I don't remember the name of Lee's biographer, who I think wrote a 3-volume biography in the 1940s, but he had recently acquired that letter of Lee's, and he kept very quiet about it because he thought it made Lee look bad. But it wasn't until much later that someone figured out that there was no lighthouse keeper in that lighthouse in 1835, and where Lee writes about the lighthouse keeper being irascible and full of venom, he was clearly talking about a snake and not about a human being. That's a very funny story.
Yep.
Pealey Passage Light. It's the third light to be erected on this location, the middle ground shoal that extends northward from Pealey Island in western Lake Erie. The major shipping channel in Lake Erie runs north of Pealey Island, and so you need some good markers out there. The southeast shoal light is built on a little reef there. Back in the 1920s, there used to be a lightship there earlier. Middle Island is fascinating because it's what we look at from our house on Middle Bass Island. It's 7 miles due east of us. The US-Canadian border goes just south of it. It's the southernmost point of land in Canada. The trivia fact about it is that 27 US states have some land north of Middle Island. There's the old lighthouse, an early picture of it, and ruins later. Whoops. And interesting letter that I have that was addressed to the lighthouse keeper on Middle Island in 1887 and contained his paycheck receipt, which I actually have. During Prohibition, the island was a way station for alcohol. Gangster Joe Roscoe acquired part of the island and built a 7-room clubhouse. Down at the bottom, it says Middle Island was purchased in 1999 by the Nature Conservancy of Canada and then donated to the Canadian National Park System. It's a wildlife preserve at this point. Kelly's Island, the biggest of the US islands. Definitely a lot of Native Americans spent time there who left 2 inscription rocks. In the beginning of the War of 1812, there was a military rendezvous post, first by the British and later by the US military. Another trivia fact is that in the Civil War, the US Army considered building a prison there, but decided to build it on Johnson's Island instead because putting the prison on Kelly's Island would mean that the soldiers would be too close to wineries.
Mike, let me also just let you know that we just have a couple minutes left before we should wrap up.
Yep, I'm trying to wrap up.
Yep, great, good.
Island
Fascinating.
Known for quarries and vineyards, pictures of the glacial grooves. Buckeye Island is a small island off South Bass Island that used to have a single house on it. Ballast Island is the one I mentioned that has the 9 homes on it. I will skip the detailed history except to say that for years it was the summer headquarters of the US Canoe and Kayak Club until they got tired of always being in the same location and decided to start moving. And of course, the Battle of Lake Erie. I'm not going to cover any detail about that. I hope that most of us know something about that. We do need to mention that South Bass Island has what we call Perry's Monument, Perry's Victory and International Peace Memorial. You can take an elevator to the top and get a wonderful view of all of the islands on that. Gibraltar Island in the foreground on the left there is basically a marine biological station for Ohio State University. Also has what's called Cook's Castle, which was the summer home of Jay Cook, who was the Civil War financier. Little picture of the castle. South Bass Island is the biggest tourist destination for day tripping in the Lake Erie Islands. I will skip most of this history. I think this will all be available after the fact to anybody who wants to see it.
Yep, it will be archived and on our website.
Yeah. I've occasionally dabbled with doing some hand coloring of old black and white pictures. This is one that I hand colored. It's an 1876 picture of one of the largest hotels on Burgundy Bay before the Hotel Victory, or actually the largest hotel. Had rooms for 1,000 people. There's a picture from the Burgundy Bay house showing the boathouse in the background. I don't know if you can read the sign that says Burgundy Bay House Boats. The whole Hotel Victory is famous. It was the largest hotel west of Saratoga, I think, for many, many years. 625 guest rooms, burned in 1919. Burgundy Bay today is a huge destination for boats. Sailboats anchor in the harbor, power boats anchor closer in. Middle Bass Island, you can see the big new marina that we have in the lower right. We talked a little bit about that. Most relevant pieces here are that, let's go to the next slide. In 1854, there was an ad in the Buffalo paper, Middle Bass Island was for sale. 4 people basically bought up the island, subdivided it into smaller parcels. Same thing actually happened to South Bass around that time. The Edwards family was not selling private parcels, but they sold the whole island in the early 1850s, and De Rivera started splitting South Bass up into 10-acre parcels, I think. And the islands early on were basically places where just about everybody grew grapes, just about everybody did a lot of serious fishing, and most of the people sold their grapes to 1 or 2 big grape producers. And Middle Bass Island, it was early on the south end of the island. I'll skip that, but there's the original Golden Eagle Winery on Middle Bass. It was the largest winery in the US in 1874 and 75. Became a tourist destination for many years. Had a famous club for the rich and wealthy of Toledo. President-elect William Howard Taft spent some time at the Middle Bass Club during his campaign in 1908. Sugar Island, we've mentioned, it's the island that was connected to Middle Bass. This has 4 or 5 cottages. July 23 was visited by the first Miss America, mostly because she was a family friend of the people in Columbus, Ohio that owned the island. Rattlesnake Island is a big private club today, very exclusive. Don't try to take your boat there. You will be kicked off in a heartbeat. It does have a 5-star restaurant, the only one on the islands. I think the admission fee is $80,000 and then $30,000 a year or something like that, but whatever. Green Island, off the west shore of South Bass Island, has a lot of interesting history. I will have to skip over that most of that now. Let's say that there's the second Green Island Lighthouse in 1885, probably the lighthouse keeper and his daughter in front of it. Mouse Island, close to Catawba Island, was the summer residence of Governor and then President Rutherford B. Hayes. Had some cabins back in the first part of the 20th century. And with that, I'm done.
Great, Mike, thank you so much. What a great tour through the Lake Erie Islands for all of us to become familiar with. I want to thank you so much for the presentation. Also, Mike, at some point, I'll see if you know anything about the Jesuit pair in any of your travels, and if so, I'll put you in touch with Tina and the Slow Food Network. But thank you all. Online, you've been listening to Mike Gora, an author and historian about the history of the Great Lakes, of the Lake Erie Islands. And again, I want to thank you all who've made financial contributions to the Stewardship Network. Your tax-deductible donation helps enable us to continue to broadcast these free online interactive webcasts. Your donations will be matched dollar for dollar right now, going twice as far. Encourage you all to check out the agenda. We're really looking forward to bringing you all together virtually at the end of January, beginning at noon Eastern. We do an annual photography competition, and we have over 1,000 photos that are contributed. The deadline for that is the 15th. Encourage you all, if you're photographers from share your photos from throughout this year. It's really, really fun for us to look through them all and share them with others. So again, we will be back here on the second Wednesday in January, the 13th, during the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. And we'll be talking about failure in conservation and a great research that Alison Catalano has been doing on that. So it's really, I really thoroughly enjoy sharing this work. So really appreciate you all. Keep staying safe. Take care of each other. Be kind, and we'll look forward to being back together with us. Our door's always open. Thanks so much for being with us.